going to start recording. All right, good morning, everybody. We are in Tanya Teshuva, the treatise on Teshuva, which is taking us to chapter 4 of the book. We are just around section 3, really section 4, but I think there's a typo in the book where it says section 3, but it's on page 75. Because the real section 3, I think, was on 68. Anyway, so we're on, and I see Steve waiting to come in. Okay, cool. So we are on section 4, but I'm just going to give a little bit of a quick, brief review. There's not going to be, there's only a page and a half, sorry, 2 pages left to the chapter. So I just want to give a little bit of a brief, just a few minute overview, just in case we're getting a little caught up in the nitty gritty. I just want to give you the broad spectrum of what we're looking at over here. Is we're looking at the Kabbalah of Teshuva. What that means is, in the first 3 chapters of the book, we were really delving into the basics of Teshuva, which is what is Teshuva, when do we do Teshuva, what is Teshuva not referring to. We discussed fasting at length. But then what we really ended the 3 chapters with was the idea that even after Teshuvah and after atonement, there's another step we want to take in order to be back with a clean slate, like nothing even happened. So that's going a step beyond Teshuvah, which is really the gift that comes after Teshuvah. To be like, we gave the example, like a servant who the king got upset at. So even after the king forgives him, he wants to send a gift ahead of him in order to be to placate the king, as if nothing happened, as if it was totally wiped away. So chapter 4 continues the discussion from that idea, where now we want to get into the Kabbalah of Teshuvah. And I planned, I'm just going to pull up in a moment. Sorry, everyone, just give me a minute. I promised you guys last week that I was going to write it down on the board. So I'm just going to share my screen in a moment. I just pause this for a moment. Okay. So the point over here is that Teshuva also has a much deeper meaning. What we call it is the Kabbalah of Teshuva. What we mean by that is Teshuva, which means to return. Hashuv also means to return. The hey at the end of Teshuva is basically saying Tashuv hey. Break it up to mean return the hey. And the hey is referring to the letter hey of God's name, that in the name of God, known as the Tetragrammaton, or we refer to it as Havaya, but it's really spelled with a yud, then a hey, a vav, and then another hey. So there's 2 heys in God's holy name, in Havaya. And Teshuvah means to return the hey. There's the lower hey, the higher hey. The first hay of Teshuvah is considered the higher hay, and then there's the second hay of Teshuvah, which is considered the lower hay. Having said that, what this means is that there's really 2 levels of Teshuvah. One is to return the lower hay back into the name of God, and the higher level of Teshuvah is to return the higher hay back into the name of God. So Teshuvah is restoring the damage that sin causes. There's a damage that sin causes here in this world, but there's also a damage and a fragmentation that is being caused in the higher worlds, and more specifically in the name of God. When a person sins, they're causing a separation between the letter Hey and the rest of God's name. So Teshuvah is now to return the Hey back into and restore it back into God's name. How do we do that? So we continue to explain that our soul is rooted in God's name. And we quoted a verse that says, Ki chelek havaya amo, that is, people are the portion of Havaya, which means that our souls are rooted in the letters of God's name. That is our source. And the Tanya in this chapter continued to explain something that we're familiar with already from previously, that the rest of the universe are created by God's speech. God said, and it came to be, like the Psalms say, Kihu Tziva v'nivro, he commanded and it came to be. Hu Amar Vayehi, he said and it was. But the souls are created from God's breath. And we all know that to speak doesn't require much effort, but yet to breathe, it requires much more effort and you get exhausted after a much shorter amount of time because it exerts a lot more energy. So the universe is created with the speech of God, which means with the outer energy of God, whereas the souls are created with the inner energy, with the breath, with the pneumius, with the inner part of God, which is in God's names. There's Elokim and Havaya. Elokim is the lower name of God, which is how God created the rest of the universe. And therefore, the first verse of the Torah, which describes the creation of the universe, it starts with Bereshit bara Elokim. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But what name of God is mentioned over there? It's Elokim. But with the creation of souls, it's created by Havaya, the higher name of God. And that's where our soul's coming from, is from that deeper root. Next, the Tanya in this chapter continues to explain the code, or what we try to do is decode the name of Havaya. That now that we know that we are rooted in Havaya, in God's holy name, the Tetragrammaton, and the rest of and the rest of the universe is created by God's speech. So we want to prove how we are rooted in Havaya. And then if we prove that, if we show how we're rooted in Havaya, it gives us access to understand that through our Teshuva, we're actually able to repair and restore the name of God, because that is our root. So therefore, through us doing Teshuva, we're bringing back the letter Hey back into God's holy name. And therefore, Teshuva means Tashuv Hey, to return the Hey back into Havaya. The way we explained it is that you have the Yud of God's name, and the Yud is referring to the power of Chakma. And actually, let me just explain one more thing. The way we're going to explain it is the four letters of God's name are symbolizing our a code for the 10 energies of our soul, 10 soul energies, which mirror the 10 energies of God, the 10 sefirot, which are the 10 divine powers of God. So God created the world using 10 divine powers, and mirroring those same 10 divine powers known as sefirot, we also have the 10 energies of our soul. So they're two things, but they mirror each other. So what the Tanya does till the end of the chapter is he explains how the four letters of God's name are a code for the 10 sefirot, and also mirroring that 10 sefirot is also a code for the 10 soul powers that we possess, the 10 kochot hanefesh, the 10 powers of the soul. So what we continue to explain is you have the Yud of God's name, and in the divine energies and the Sefirot of God, the Yud, which is the smallest of Hebrew letters, is a reference for the highest of divine powers of Sefirot, which is called Chachma. Chachma, which is generally translated as wisdom, over here we translate it as inquiry. And it's the initial experience, how God is starting to take his energy and bring it down into the world. I just want to quote you the words over here that we said. We started with a quote from the Zohar on this, and we said like this: the first letter of the Tetragrammaton, which is the Yud, is the small point, and it hints to God's Chachma, which begins in a totally concealed state and then diffuses outwards to power the intellectual process. So that's the Yud of the divine powers, where it's totally concealed, and now it's starting to take some um, uh, um, um, outward movement in order to power something else, in order to power the intellectual process. So it's taking what's concealed, what's totally hidden, and now starting process to power it outward for the intellectual process. And then we went even one step further, that there's a little point above the yud, and that's referring to it's like pointing upwards, and that's referring to the power of will, which is like the crown of God in Hebrew is known as Keter, and that's even beyond Chachma. And then from that yud, which is the Chachma, the inquiry or the concealed part that is now coming to be as a outward power, we come to the hay, which is expanding and broadening that light that was so concealed, and now it's starting to take some form. That's happening through the letter hay, which is the level of bina, and that is more broad. It's more expansion and comprehension, but that's still within a mental capacity. It's still hidden within God's divine light. But now it takes on some form for expression. And that's the way it reaches the emotions, which is going to be the next two letters of God's name, the Vav and the He. The Vav is referring to the emotions of God, starting with kindness. And then we went to um, Gevura, which we translated either as judgment, discipline, and fear. Then we had Tiferes, which is compassion, harmony, and truth. We had Netzach, which is endurance. We had Hod, which is splendor and gratitude. And then you would have Yesod, which is connection. Those are six emotional sefirot, which are hinted to in the letter Vav of God's name, which the letter Vav equals the number six. It's the sixth letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And it also has it's shaped like a line from high to low, from up to down. And that's how, from the mental power, you then develop an emotion and how it's coming down to be expressed. So the emotions are the expression of the soul, and that's how you're ready to communicate that with someone else. And that's hinted to in the Vav, whereas in the first two letters of God's name, the divine powers of Chachma and Bina is more concealed. It's more within God's spiritual mind, so to speak, within the mental capacity. And now you have the emotional energies, which is here to be giving expression. It's to be revealed. So that's the two last letters of God's name, the Vav, which is revealing the expressions of the six emotions. And then you have the Hey, which is the lowest, the way it's actually being spoken and articulated to someone else. So that's where we have it in the divine powers of God. And now what we're going to do in this section, the last section of the chapter, is we're going to explain it how it also um, mirrors within the person and their 10 soul powers. We already kind of explained them together because the chachma, the way it is by God, is similar to the chachma the way we have it, the power of inquiry to what's concealed. But we're going to express it now in the actual words of the text um, on page 75, which we'll do that
I,
shortly.
I have a question on page 69 in the practical lesson.
Mm-hmm.
In the, it has the 10 sphero.
Yeah.
At one point you started to talk and I got lost. Okay, so the top is
Sure.
the keter, then
Yeah.
the hokmah, which you said is the mind, bina
Yeah.
is the emotional, and then you were talking about, and so I lost what da'as was, but you said chesed was the right arm, gevurah was the left arm, and then malkut was speech. But could you review those again?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, the first Keter is not even on this list because it's not part of the 10. It's really what's beyond the 10, and it's hinted to in the top of the Yud. So, but let's just focus on these 10. The first three, which is Chachma, Bina, and Das, are actually all three of them are the cognitive. All three of those are the intellectual process. You have the intellectual process of inquiry, cognition, and recognition. All three are actually in the mind, right? Chachma, Bina, and Das, which is the acronym of Chabad, those are known as the three upper of the Sefirot, the three higher, and those are the mental capacity, the cognitive, intellectual process, all three of those. Now, if you were to, what the Tanya did here, he was focusing on the Chachma and the Bina, which is hinted to in the letter Yud and the letter Hey. The Chachma, which is going to be hinted to in the letter Yud, that's the highest of the mental, cognitive, intellectual power, which is the power of taking the concealed, what is you're inquiring from what's above, and getting a flash of an idea. That's the chachma. Now, if someone were to interrupt you while you're in a creative mindset. Actually, just on Shabbos, we have around once a month or whatever, every maybe 2 months, we have a family Shabbat. And one of the young dads that joins us, he's a creator for Disney. So I don't know exactly what his job is, but he writes script for the writer. So I don't know exactly what his title is, but he's not the famous person, but he gives the ideas to the writers, something like that. And anyway, him and his wife were talking about, their carpool, how they work out they only have one car. Anyway, what they were saying is that Mike, who's the husband, when he can't do carpool because for him, he can't just leave, do carpool, and come back. For him, it's like this: if he loses, gets distracted, he has to start again from the beginning, and it could be another 20 hours of work just to get to where he was. So I found it so interesting to hear. That's going to be the level of chachma, which is where you're coming up with an idea, but if something happens during that idea, you don't even know where to start again. You have to start all over because it's just a flash. It's like if you don't see it, it's gone. If you don't hold on to it, you lost it. So that's going to be the inquiry stage, which in the letters of God's name, that's the smallest letter. It's the humblest letter. It's the yud because it's really um, still in the concealed state. It's trying to inquire to what's above and what's concealed, and you're trying to get an idea out of it. But it's so raw that you can't even forget about communicating it. You're not even sure what it is yet. You're not even sure if it's a real idea. Then comes the next intellectual process, which is bina, which is cognition. That's the place where it's making sense to you now. You're understanding it. You're analyzing it. You're um, researching it more. You're comprehending it. So that's going to be the expanding of the idea, and that's like in the letter Hey, it's an expanded letter. It's a broad letter because here you're giving form to it. You're giving it color, but that's still within you. It's still concealed. It's all within your mind. Then comes the next two levels, which over here in the practical lesson that you referred to, Lynn, it's going to be the six, really the bottom seven, which are emotional. The vav of God's name it's expressing the emotions. It's now from the intellectual, you got an idea, it makes sense to you. Now you're excited about it. Now you want to bring it out to the world. It makes you extra kind, or it makes you more worried. Whatever the idea that you're having, makes you compassionate and empathetic. It makes you have perseverance and endurance. It makes you um, have the feeling of gratitude. Whatever feeling that you're having, it's starting with the mind, and now it's being expressed. The expression starts in the heart, it's still within you, but it's revealing, it's expressing that emotion. And then from there, it goes to the last hey of God's name, which is expanding it to the next level, which is communicating it out to someone else. So you have the first hey, which is expanding an idea, but it's concealed within you. The second hey of God's name is after it's already emotional and expressing emotions. Now you're communicating that it's manifesting the idea outward. That's going to be the last hey of God's name. In Hebrew, it's known as the divine power of Malchus, where when God created the world, it started with Chachma. It then goes to Bina. It then goes to the emotions, and only then God actually executes the plan, which is Malchus. That's the final step, the process outward. King David, for example, is known to be that level of Malchus because King David actually brought about, was the one bringing the ideas forward. So you had Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov; those were different emotions. You had Moshe, which is level of Chachma, communicating the Torah, obviously, and then you have King David, which is the level of Malchus. And as you touched on briefly, Lynn, it also deals with different parts of our body connecting to each of these 10 Sefirot, and Malchus being the power of speech. So that's in the mouth. Let's see. Any other questions? Okay.
Where does da'at fit? It's in the cognitive as well then? the
So,
recognition.
interesting. Over here, we didn't focus on Das, and in the beginning, in chapter 3 of the first book, so it's before I met you, Lynn. Even that's where Das was took the whole chapter 3 of the first book of Tanya actually focuses on Das, and the main thing that it wants to bring out is Das is the bridge between the intellectual to the emotional. It's the application of an idea into our into our heart. So it's to take from the mind into the heart. And I just want to give you a few examples of that from the Torah. And again, this is from chapter 3 of the first book. It says, "V'ha'adam yada et Chava." It says, Adam knew
His
his
wife.
wife Eve, and they gave birth to a child. So that is not just knowing, it's a deep, intimate level of knowing where it becomes yours. You become one with the idea. Or in the verse of the Torah, the term used for conception, for the idea of actually bringing a child to the world, came through das, because das is what gives birth for the idea to give birth to a feeling. So that's the practical application of the mind to now become in the heart. Now, there are people that are very good in the mind, and yet they have no emotions. They're, either absent-minded or whatever you want to call them. They're just mind people without any feeling, because they could have a great chachma, a great bina. They're analytical, but then when it comes to actually developing it into the heart, they're lost because they're missing that das, the bridge between the mind to the heart is lacking. So therefore, their power to be patient is not there because they're not able to get the patience, which is part of the power of hod, humility, splendor, gratitude. All that is patience. They don't have that because they're just in the mind. And many other things. So das is a crucial element that in the four letters of God's name you don't see because that's bridge to get from the hey to the vav. It's the bridge in between those letters. So it's almost like the unwritten. It's it's not a black ink. It's between the hey and the vav. You need to have that power of das. Awesome. Any other questions? Okay, I'm just trying to bring it up on the screen. And unfortunately, I couldn't find this. I'm just going to retype it. Everyone, just give me 1 second. And okay, sorry about that. I'm just going to share my screen and make it a little bigger. So again, here we go. Okay, so I know this is really small. Let me make this much bigger. How's that? Okay, so we have the Yud of God's name that's referring to the power of Chachma. We have the Hey of God's name, which is the expansion of that idea from Chachma now into Bina, which is cognition. Then you have the Vav, which is bringing the idea from the concealed mental power to now be in the emotions, which the Vav is the number 6, which is the 6 emotions from Chesed, which is kindness, to Gevura, which is either discipline, strength, judgment, and fear, to then be in Tiferet, which is beauty, which is a reference to empathy, compassion, harmony, which is blending ideas together. And as Shira mentioned last week, um, that's the beautiful combination, that level of Tiferet between Abraham and Yitzchak. Abraham was the power of kindness, but he could have too much kindness. Yitzchak, Isaac, was the power of Gevura, which is discipline, giving to people who deserve, judgment, strength, but you could have too much of that. Yaakov was the perfect combination of his father and grandfather, which is compassion. To be able to give and know your limits, and even if they don't deserve it, you could still give it, but it's with compassion, not just with um, uh, dispensing it with no purpose. Then you come to Netzach, you come to Hod, which is the power of endurance, the power of gratitude and humility and splendor. Then you have Yesod, which is actually Yosef Atzadik was that power of Yesod, the connector and communication. And then you have the Hey, which is this one, which is the second Hey of God's name, which is the power of Malchus, which is actually the communication of that feeling. So expressing that feeling into the world. So just back to God's name over here, you have Tashuv, and then if you would put a line in between it, you would have Tashuv Hey. Do that again, 1 second. Much better. You have Tashuv Hey, which is to return the Hey. And which Hey are we returning? One of two of them. So you have the lower Hey and the higher Hey. So what it comes out to is you actually have two levels of Teshuvah. You have a lower level of Teshuvah, which is repairing the lower Hey of God's name. But then you also have a higher level of Teshuvah that we'll have to get to, which is repairing the higher level of God's name. So it's interesting. Another point we mentioned in the chapter is there are certain sins that Teshuvah can't help. The Alter Rebbe says, how is that possible? Teshuvah is for every mitzvah, for everything, for every sin. So we explained that what that means is it may not help if you use a lower level of teshuvah, but if you harness or you tap into the higher level of teshuvah, then it can help. Teshuvah can help for everything. You may just need to come on to the higher level of teshuvah, which is reaching the higher level of God's name. If you were to divide the name of God in two, so if you were to make this is the higher level of God's name, which is the concealed, what's in the God's divine powers of Sefirot. It's the intellectual way of how God created the world. And then you have the Vav and Hey, which is the revealed, which is more the emotional. Now, the lower level of Teshuvah affects the revealed part of God's name. The higher level of Teshuvah it could affect and repair the higher level of God's name. Any questions? Yes, Shira.
So you said that the Vav actually symbolizes the emotional attributes.
Yeah, we could. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So when we work on ourselves before Shavuos on the emotional attributes, we're actually working on the Vav, I guess, and then when we actually work on ourselves to actually get stronger, we send it back up to Hashem. Is that what happens?
So interesting. So during the 7 weeks that we count the Omer, which is what we're doing now, we're working on the 7 emotions, which is the Vav, which is the higher 6 of them, and the Hey, which is the Malchut, which is the lowest of them. So we start with working on the first 6, and then we move on to working on the Malchut, which is the lowest of the Sefirot. So it's the Vav and the Hey. So during the Omer, we're working on the lower level of God's name, which is the easier for us to access because it's the lower level of Teshuvah. So yeah, we're working on the Vav and the Hey.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And it's not working on it the way it is in God's name. It's working on it the way it's in our divine, in our soul powers. So, and that's actually what we're about to get into now, that the level of the letters of God's name exists as godly, as divine powers, which we call it Sefirot, but it also mirrors of how God made the DNA of our soul. So our soul is comprised of those 10, the same set of 10, but not as Sefirot. It's the way our soul is wired. So our soul works with Chachma, which means we inquire to what we don't know. And then we bring the idea into our mind and analyze it. And then we apply it, which is Das. And then we get it gives birth to an emotion within us. It gives birth to an emotion of excitement, love, kindness, charity. It gives birth to an emotion of fear, being anxious, or the feeling of discipline, or exacting judgment and strength. And then it comes to a feeling of compassion. So that's feelings the way our soul is comprised. And that mirrors the way God created the world with the same set of 10 Sefirot. So that's what we're about to get into now, how the letters of God's name is also code for the 10 soul powers of our DNA, of our soul. Yes, Lynn.
So I just read something the other day. I don't know if I can find it, but it was saying that even after you give, for women, after they give birth to children, that some of the, I don't know what it is, like the, not DNA, but some of the cells of the child still reside in the mother. I don't know if you've read this before,
Wow, no.
but
It's
yeah,
amazing.
but anyway, so when your child is hurt, the mother actually still has this connection of hurtness. She can't control it because it came from the kid, but you have these same things and it keeps you connected. And I was two things. One, I was thinking when our children sin, we hurt because we know that they've crossed a boundary or however you want to call it. And so I was thinking about Hashem when we sin, how it's like there's more desire to repair it. It's like, okay, I messed up, I'll take care of it. But if you realize you hurt somebody else, then there's kind of more responsibility and need to like, oh my gosh, I've hurt God's heart. I need to take care of this. So anyway, that was what I was thinking is that God still with his creation of when he breathed life into us, part of him is in us. And so when we hurt, he hurts.
Amazing. And that's actually one of the main themes over here. And that's why Teshuva is so important. It's not only for ourselves and for our soul, it's for God. There's a fragmentation that's hurting by God, and that's our responsibility to repair. And as a result of it being hurt by God, it actually affects the whole universe. And it's similar to the idea of an emotion. Our emotions could affect our mind. When a person is heartbroken, it's very hard for them to concentrate.
Mhm.
And it's exactly like what you were saying. The cells could remain in the mother, where the mother over here is the intellectual power of Bina. And even after it gives birth to an idea and a feeling, the idea develops a feeling, could still, make its way back up. And the feeling could affect the mind of it. And therefore, when we do teshuva, we're able to repair that as well. I think one of the Hasidic insights we had at the beginning of the chapter was when a person, I think it was a letter from the Rebbe, that when a person sins, it's all it's all of our responsibility to help that person, because it's almost like person's on a boat and they saying, this is my seat, I could drill a hole underneath it. No, all of us are affected by the hole that you're making on the boat because we're all together. Therefore, the sin that one person is doing affects Hashem and it affects the rest of the universe, and therefore it's all of our responsibility to help that person. In fact, when we do our tachnun, which is the penitent prayer. We say it actually daily in the morning and afternoon. We actually always say it in the plural, because we're not only talking about the sins that we did today, because hopefully we didn't do all of these sins, but we're saying it on behalf of all of us because we're all responsible, as the Talmud says, "Arevim zelos," that we're all responsible for each other. All right, with that, let's go to section 4.
Rabbi,
Oh yes, Freda.
excuse me, but
Sure.
when exactly did our sages discover the 10 Sefirot?
I missed some of the words. When exactly did we discover?
Did our sages
Ah,
discover the 10 Sefirot and what we're learning now?
so that's a good question. It's the source that we're referring to here in the Tanya is, if you look back on page 68, the last line, it refers to Elijah's teaching. It's called Patak Eliyahu, and it's from the Zohar. It's a section of the Zohar called Patak Eliyahu. It's from the Tikkun Zohar, and the Zohar is from, just to give us some of the background. The Zohar is from like 1800 years ago. Um, but there's even books that are from before, um, that many people study that are even earlier than the Zohar. One of the famous books is said to have been written by Abraham. That's going back all the way to the beginning of Jewish history. So
Right.
this is, and the point is that when God gave the Torah at Sinai, he didn't just give the revealed Torah, like the laws, the hidden Torah was also given. It was just not uncovered for a while until later, but it was definitely there.
Okay.
But it's a good question. All right, we're going to continue inside now. Section 4, which is on page 75 at the bottom. Unfortunately, in the book, it says section 3, but I think it's meant to say section 4, the Tetragrammaton in the soul. So in section 3, we discuss the Tetragrammaton primarily as it applies to the energies of the divine realm. Right till now, we were talking about the Sephirot, the way God used the 10 divine attributes to create the world. But the Tanya will teach us here how the same energies are present, albeit in an infinitely removed way, in the human soul, since the soul is derived from God's inner self. So now we're going to see the 10 divine powers the way it is in the neshama and the soul, because it comes from the divine Sephirot. We come from God, comes from the 4 letters of God's name. So therefore, the root of our soul is from the same root of the 10 divine powers. And the same tetragrammaton is present precisely through though figuratively speaking, in the human soul, since the comparison is obviously an utterly inadequate one, as a human being is infinitely removed from God. So the tetragrammaton is present in the human soul, meaning to say it is present in the divine soul, which God blew from within himself, as we discussed in section 1. So this came from the breath of God, which was the inner part of God, and that's where our soul is from. We learned in part 1, chapter 1, that a person possesses 2 souls, a divine soul and an animal soul. The Tanya makes clear that we are speaking here of the former, right? That of the divine soul. The Tanya will now take each of the 4 letters of the Tetragrammaton and explain their expression in human worship. So the divine soul contains Chachma, which is an undeveloped and therefore elusive intellect hinted by the letter Yud, which then powers the tangible intellectual processing of Bina, which in terms of practical worship means understanding the truth of God and his greatness. Each individual, according to his own capabilities, according to his or her intellectual, cognitive capacity. So we start with the letter Yud, which is our power of Chachma, which is undeveloped. And then it goes to Bina, which is what it means practically in serving God. It means understanding the truth of God, meaning what we're doing right now, right? That when we're studying, we're analyzing, we're processing ideas and understanding the truth of God. That's in the level of Bina. The Tanya explains how this is hinted to in the shape of the hay. When a person thinks deeply, expanding his or her mind and cognitive powers to contemplate the greatness of God, the process of Bina is hinted to by the shape of the letter He, which is a wide letter representing the expansion of cognitive powers. And the vertical height of the He signifies the application of the idea to produce love and reverence of God from the Bina process and contemplation of God's greatness, and to produce the derivative emotions which arise from love and reverence. We turn to the experience of the last 2 letters of the Tetragrammaton, which is the Vav and the He. The emotions generated by Bina initially arise in the brain and the hidden places of the heart, and subsequently they become palpable in the heart, which is the experience of Vav, emotional expression. So it comes from the Yud to the He. The He is the processing of the idea with our Bina, and from there developing it to a feeling, which is going to be now expressed in the heart, and that's the experience of the Vav, which is the emotional expression. Love and reverence of God, which is hinted to by the Vav, then lead to genuine worship, which is the experience of He, actual manifestation, which is through Torah study and mitzvah observance, verbally using the voice or through action. So from the Vav, which is the emotional experience, emotional expression, it then comes to the last Hey, which is the actual manifestation, which is studying Torah, praying, using our voice and action into performing God's will. So that's now we have in our soul the 4 letters of God's name, hinted to by the Chachma, the Bina, and then the 6 emotions, and finally the Malchut, which is the last letter, Hey, of God's name. These 2 processes of the Vav and the Hey, which is emotional expression, which is the Vav, followed by practical worship, are represented by the last 2 letters of the Tetragrammaton, which is the Vav and the Hey, respectively. In a concluding thought, the Tanya notes a further allusion in the letter Yud. So I guess I just want to make sure the Vav and the Hey make sense. Let me just go back to just sharing the Vav and the Hey. The way we're explaining it now is actually within our soul. We have 2 souls, the divine soul and the natural soul, the animalistic soul. What we're saying is the 4 letters of God's name exist and are the root, the code of our divine soul. So we have our divine soul starts with a Yud, which is the inquiry, continues with the Hey, which is expanding the idea, but both of those are still hidden within the person, within the soul. But now it starts getting expression, which is through the Vav, the feelings, the 6 feelings, and finally the last of the feeling, which is Malchut, is hinted to by the Hey, which is expanding the expression to be out there in the world, which is through our speech. So it's the actual action of the feeling. In our Torah observance, in our mitzvah, in our prayer, it's using our speech, it's using our action, and that's hinted to in the Hey. The last thing we just explained is that the Vav and the Hey, which is the emotional expression of the Vav, and the practical worship, which is the action that we do, those are hinted to in the last 2 letters of God's name. Okay, hope that was clear. Let's just bring back the screen and we'll wrap up the chapter.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a lot of the flashes of insight and trying to grab at them and trying to bring them down
Yeah.
into the practical world, and I'll get it and I'll lose it and I'll get it and I'll lose it. Does Tanya have a way to actually learn to discipline how to work through, to capture, and to not manage, but to harness that power? Because I have thoughts around a certain area, but I can't quite get my hands around it. And it's frustrating because I'll have a flash of insight but I can't really get it all the way into the practical.
That's a great question. So I could tell you which chapter explains the Yud, which is how to get the Chachma. That's in the early 40s. I could tell you which chapter talks about the Das, which is chapter 3. But which chapter expands on the idea of Bina, like how to capitalize on the idea and expand it. Does anyone know, Steve? Does anything come up from all your Tanya study?
No,
What,
no, not at
what
all.
chapter is Bina? That's a great question, Lynn. And I should know the answer because we went through Tanya together. Can I get back to you?
Sure. But I think I'm onto something, but I can't quite get it or articulate it. And I'll get pieces of it. And it's
Totally.
like flashes of insight, and then it's gone and then it comes back. So
I'm just writing this rant down. Bina. I'm going to research this for you.
thank you.
Method.
Because what I'm doing is I'm gathering little bits and pieces of it, but it's not comprehensive. And I know that I'm nibbling around the edges of this idea, but I
Yeah.
want to have it so clear that everything I do radiates out, not kind of nibbling from the outside in.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. I'm gonna check. I'm gonna look into this and I'll text you and get back to you hopefully today.
I'll text you with the general idea so you'll know
Yeah,
where.
okay, that's brilliant. Okay, thank you. I hope I have the answer. Okay, thank you. All right, now we'll wrap up the chapter and here we go. In a concluding thought, the Tanya notes a further allusion in the letter Yud. The contemplative process of Bina the cognition and comprehension of the truth of God's existence and his greatness is also powered by the Torah. For Torah emerged from Chachma, and Chachma is the Yud of the Tetragrammaton. Let's just read this last paragraph to make sure we can understand this. In the Tetragrammaton, Yud is followed by Hey, to indicate that contemplation, which is Bina, and the letter Hey, is powered by Chachma. Practically speaking, we use sources to provide the raw materials for our contemplative process. We use Torah sources to provide raw materials for our contemplative process. This is a further hint in the Yud, which also alludes to the Torah, which emerged from Chachma. So there's something deep going on in this last paragraph. And what we're saying is the power of comprehension, of cognition, which is Bina, is rooted in the Torah, which is hinted to by the letter Yud. Why? Because the Yud is Chachma and Torah is God's wisdom. So why is the Yud coming before the Hey? To teach us that the Bina power of analyzing an idea is powered by Chachma, which is using Torah sources for our contemplative process. Lynn, there's a lot here answering your question. I just don't fully understand it. If I'm understanding this correctly, the power of Bina, which is to analyze an idea, is using Torah tools, Torah sources, in order to grasp the idea. So you have an idea and you want to bring it down into Bina, it comes through, it has to come from the Yud to the Hey, which is the Yud powering the Hey, which is the Chachma, and Torah powering and giving room for the Bina to do its job. I don't fully understand this last paragraph. I'll have to look into this. Does anyone understand how this works? From the Yud, one of the reasons why the Yud comes before the Hey, we're saying here, is because the Yud has to power the Hey. The Bina, which is the analyzing and comprehension of an idea, the cognition, could only do its work if it has the Yud backing it up, and if it's preceded by the Yud, which is the power of the Torah to inquire over an idea. I don't fully get it, and I don't think there's a practical lesson on this little paragraph.
Could it mean that you need to stay inspired in order to really contemplate an idea? You have to be connected to the divine inspiration in order for Bina to fully be electrified or powered. That once you lose
I
that,
like it, but wouldn't you? I like I'm just going to nitpick on a word because I do agree you have to be plugged in, but the word inspiration sounds more emotional, no?
what I mean is you're inspired by the divine rather than by your personal ego to learn. Once you become, it's about my learning it, I want it, then you don't have that divine connection anymore, and you may not contemplate it fully.
I think that's exactly what he's saying here. I love it. Meaning it's coming from the Torah. So as long as you're humbled to the source, which is the Torah, and inspired by that idea, then you'll be successful in your Bina process. But if it's all about I'm eager to prove myself, then you're losing the Bina. You're not connected to the Chachma anymore.
Correct.
I like that. I like that.
Okay.
Does anyone agree with what Steve just said? Because
Yes.
all right, we got Freda agreeing with you, Steve. And Lynn just gave a thumbs up. And okay. And we got Naomi nodding. So Steve, you're in good company here. I like it. I'm curious, Lynn, if I'm going to ask some people, and if I may hear back that, chapter 4 of Igeret Teshuva is where the Alter Rebbe analyzes the Bina process. And so I'm curious to know if this will be the answer to your question. I'm curious. We'll have to find out. All right, let's just wrap up with some practical lessons. There is a radical difference. So the way the practical lessons work on the Kindle is that it just adds all the practical lessons from interspersed throughout the chapter all the way at the end. So now this is going back to the beginning of the chapter where it says there is a radical difference between the divine energy invested in your soul and the divine energy invested in the rest of the universe. Right? We explained that the divine energy in the rest of the universe is from the speech, which is external part of God that didn't take a lot of effort, so to speak, whereas the soul is powered, invested by the breath of God, the neshima, the breath of God, which is um, which is deeply rooted, and it's from the innermost part of God, the pnimiut. The energy in your soul is from deep within God, His breath. The energy of the rest of the universe is relatively superficial, like speech. The 10 fundamental divine energies Sefirot are Chachma, Ina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchus. The 4 letters of the Tetragrammaton represent the flow of energy of the divine realm, which is mirrored by the flow of intellect and emotion in your soul. So again, that's a mirroring thing where you have the 4 letters of God's name of Sefirot, and then you have the 4 letters of God's name mirroring those 10 Sefirot in your DNA of your soul, the 10 divine powers of your soul, the intellect and emotions. When the Torah uses the metaphor of speech in reference to God, it means this power of manifestation, which is Malchus. And the letters of God's speech are packets of energy which power the universe. So God's speech is the energy which God uses to power the universe, and that was done through Malchus, which is God's power of speech. So I'm not expecting any of us to remember, but going back to the chapters 40s, a big topic over there was about Malchus of Atzilus. We have 4 spiritual worlds where we are in the lowest of the 4, called Asiya. But the highest of the 4 was called Atzilus, the world of emanation. And in that world of Atzilus, we had the 10 divine Sefirot, from Chachma all the way to Malchus. And the lowest of the 10 Sefirot, which is Malchus, so Malchus of the world of Atzilus, is where God created the world from. Starting with an idea of Chachma, all the way through the emotions God had in creating the world. So the actual creation of the world happened in the level of Malchus, of the world of Atzilus. And then from there came the next world. And again, you have 10 divine Sefirot in the world of Bria. And then you have 10 divine Sefirot in the world of Yetzirah. And then you have 10 divine Sefirot in our world, which is the lowest of the 4 worlds, the world of Asiya. So if you were to do the math, there isn't just 10 divine Sefirot, there's actually 40. The main 10 are in the highest of the worlds, which is where God actually created the world. But then you have the world of souls, which is in the world of Bria. And they are created from the 10 Sefirot as it goes down, and then the world of angels, and then our world down here. Okay, so that was just an extra layer, but this I think was a beautiful chapter where we explained and in 1-2 sentences how our job of Teshuva is not just to repair a sin that we did and ask for forgiveness. Our job of Teshuva is also to return the letter Hey back into God's holy name. And there's actually 2 letter Heys in God's name. And those are 2 levels of Teshuva. You have the letter Hey, which is the last letter of God's name, which is more He revealed the way God expresses His emotions in the Vav and the Hey. So there's the lower level of Teshuva, which is repairing the fragmentation caused through a sin in the lower level of God's name, the lower part of God's name. But then you have the higher level of Teshuva, which is repairing the higher part of God's name, which is the way God's energy was concealed in His mind. And that's our job, to reach also to the higher level of Teshuva. How do we do that? Come back next week and we'll continue in chapter 5 and 6 with the process of Teshuva, lower and higher. Okay, awesome. Thank you, everyone, for another wonderful week of Tanya. We hope to see you again next week, Wednesday morning.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
Yeah.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome, everyone. Have a great day.
Yeah.
Thank you.